And hello, you're watching Scotland at 7 on Thursday the 14th of April. I'm Hugh, Stewart in the Glasgow studio, and to discuss tonight's news I'm joined by Roger Mullin, a former Member of Parliament. And Roger, good evening. Where are you just now?
I'm based in Kirkcaldy.
And you're in Fife.
So,
You were MP
yep.
for one of the Fife constituencies, now retired. Right,
Well, I'm
so,
not retired, but I was the MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath.
oh, I see. Right, so, and you're on the fingers on the pulse of the news anyway. So we're going to discuss some of tonight's news items with you in a few minutes, Roger. But first of all, on day 50 of Russia's war in Ukraine, I'm going to run through the main update, the main stories today. First of all, the Russian Defense Ministry has said that the entire crew of the warship Moskva, reported to be struck by Ukraine in the Black Sea later Wednesday, has been evacuated after an ammunition explosion resulted in a fire on the ship. More on that in a minute. Secondly, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called for an oil embargo in his nightly address on yesterday. First of all, he said, "We need an oil embargo and Europe's clear readiness to give up all Russian energy. The European Union must stop sponsoring Russia's military machine." Thirdly, President Zelensky confirmed that forensic experts from the International Criminal Court have visited Bucha on Wednesday to investigate possible war crimes. He said, "Responsibility for the Russian military for war crimes is inevitable. We will drag them all to the tribunal, and not only for what was done in Bucha." US President Joe Biden announced an additional $800 million of military assistance to Ukraine, including heavy artillery, ahead of the wider Russian assault expected in eastern Ukraine. The package, which brings the total military aid since the Russian forces invaded in February to more than $2.5 billion, includes artillery systems, artillery rounds, armoured personnel carriers, and unmanned coastal defence boats. President Biden said in a statement following a phone call with President Zelensky. The Russian retreat from around Kyiv has led to the discovery of large numbers of apparently massacred civilians, drawing international condemnation and calls for a war crimes investigation. The Kyiv district police chief said that the bodies of 765 civilians, including 30 children, had been found around the capital. Russian troops are reportedly suffering from low morale and disenchantment among some of the younger troops. While speaking at a press conference today, Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby also said that Russian troop leaders were frustrated as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues. Finland's Prime Minister Sanna Marin said that country would decide on whether to apply for NATO membership within weeks. Speaking at a joint news conference with her Swedish counterpart, Marin said that as a NATO partner but not a member, Finland is not covered by Article 5, which states that an attack on one member should be considered an attack on all. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said it was not possible to open any humanitarian corridors yesterday, Wednesday. She said the situation along the routes was too dangerous and accused Russian forces of violating an agreement to halt the shooting while people escaped. Now, just before we move on to the more on the Moskva battleship story, Roger, do you have any comments on the widespread reports now on war crimes and what you think is a realistic chance of the International Criminal Court actually getting somebody from the Kremlin in the dock?
Right. Well, first of all, I should say that I chair a humanitarian organisation called Revive Campaign. And one of the things we do is we have a long-standing commitment and concern about innocent people who suffer the consequences of violence, explosive violence, landmines, IEDs and the like. And what I can say, we've got 3 people doing research who are from Ukraine. And so what I can say is, on the ground, the humanitarian situation is terrible, but it is not unexpected coming from the likes of the way in which Putin seems to prefer to prosecute a war. It all goes back, his whole strategy, to the Second Chechnya War and the way in which they undertook some really barbaric activities by the Russian troops in the name of their war. It included things like rape, like pillaging, targeting civilians, targeting hospitals and the like. And then, of course, some years later, you got exactly the same modus operandi from Putin in Syria, and the targeting of cities such as Aleppo and the humanitarian tragedies that ensued there. And so what is happening in Ukraine is not unexpected in terms of the way in which Putin operates, but the situation is tragic on the ground for the innocent people. It's always the innocents that suffer the most in war, of course. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I think actually the greatest priority is not to argue about the legality of individual things at the moment, but it's to try and make sure we can get the maximum humanitarian aid to those that are suffering, to the innocent people in Ukraine. And that's what myself and a lot of other people are working on to achieve. And they're very disappointed about the attitude of the UK government. I'll put it no more severely than that. A lot of the things that are in place at the moment, for example, post-Brexit, are making it more difficult than it should be to get aid from here towards the people in Ukraine.
Yes, I see. Yeah, we've heard about Brexit delays, of course, at the Channel ports. We're also going to be discussing the number of refugees who have been able to get into the UK, so that comes up later. Okay, so on war crimes, of course, Russia doesn't recognise the International Criminal Court, but mind you, neither does America. Going to move on to the story we briefly introduced earlier on about Russia's defence ministry said it was investigating what happened to its flagship cruiser, the Moskva, after Ukraine said they had hit the vessel with an anti-ship missile, forcing its crew to abandon ship. The Russian ministry denied reports that the warship had sunk to the bottom of the Black Sea. It said the Moskva had retained buoyancy with fires extinguished and the crew transferred to another vessel. Ukraine's Southern Military Command said that they had struck the Moskva with a Neptune missile and that the ship had started sinking. Fire had erupted after the missile exploded, they said on Facebook. The Ukrainian ministry added that 4 Russian ships then went to the Moskva's rescue but were hampered by stormy weather and by the ammunition blowing up on board the Moskva, that is. Unconfirmed reports suggested that the missile cruiser had turned upside down and had started to sink. The apparent attack, 50 days after Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, represents a symbolic blow for the Kremlin. The Moskva was the pride of Russia's Black Sea naval fleet and the most prestigious vessel involved in the war in Ukraine. Rumours circulating in Moscow suggested that Putin had refrained from launching a beach landing and attack on the Ukrainian port of Odessa because he wanted to preserve the Moskva from danger. Jubilant Ukrainians celebrated the ship's apparent end on social media. The Moskva gained notoriety early in the war when the crew demanded the surrender of Ukraine forces on Snake Island, prompting that famous riposte from the border guards on the warship, "Fuck you, Russian warship," on the island, sorry. The phrase instantly became a symbol of national defiance and is now a universal meme. It has appeared on a new national postage stamp as well as on checkpoints, shop windows, Ukrainian military vehicles and private cars. The Moskva, which is a crew of 510, was evacuated after ammunition caught fire, according to Russia's Interfax news agency, who declined to say what had caused the blaze. Commissioned in 1983, the ship was armed with 16 anti-ship Vulcan cruise missiles with a range of at least 440 miles. According to reports, it also carried S-300 anti-air missiles, which are crucial to Russia's air superiority over the Crimea and Ukraine's Kherson province, now occupied by Russian troops. Maxim Marchenko, the Ukrainian governor of the region around Odessa, said that the Moskva had been hit by 2 Ukrainian-made anti-ship missiles. So, Roger, it's very difficult to be clear exactly what happened. So one thing we seem to know for sure is that the Moskva is definitely out of action, has definitely suffered a big fire. But was it caused by some accident on board, or was it struck by one missile, or was it struck by 2 missiles? So there's a lot we don't know yet. We don't even know if she's sunk. But according to the reports I've been looking at today, it looks like she's probably still floating, but doesn't seem to be in fighting condition. But do you think the naval side of it is important? We've heard all about the land war and the atrocities around Kyiv as the troops have evacuated, but a lot of the attacks on cities have been from the Black Sea, haven't they, from sea-launched missiles?
Yes, I mean, I think it's hugely significant what has happened. And of course, almost regardless of whether it was just incompetence that led to a fire outbreak and then explosions, as Russia, the Kremlin seems to be indicating, or whether it was actually caused by an attack by Ukrainian forces using a couple of Neptune missiles. The significance is that this is the flagship and it's now completely out of action and it's unable to launch the types of missiles it had been launching into Ukraine. So it is a huge fillip to the morale, I would have thought, of the Ukrainians, regardless of what has occurred, to have such a significant vessel put completely out of action. The other things that are associated with that are worth bearing in mind is that we don't actually know what has happened to everyone on board. We know that there are claims that everybody has been taken off, but whether that is the case or not, I think there remains a little bit of uncertainty. And particularly of interest, I think, would be what has happened to the leadership. How are the leadership that would be based on the flagship, how they are viewed in the Kremlin now is another matter. I mean, this was a ship that was supposed to have 3 different types of sophisticated anti-missile technology to protect it from attack. And yet it has been decommissioned, if I put it like that, in very quick order. So it's a very interesting situation, but one which is to the great advantage of Ukraine.
Okay, next story we're going to look at, I have to move on. We've got quite a lot to get through tonight. Now, we've heard the story today that British Airways has had to apologise after they refused to allow a Ukrainian family, including an 8-year-old girl, to board a flight to the UK, despite them having all the correct travel documents. The family of 3 had fled their home in Kharkiv, which had endured some of the most intense Russian bombing, after waiting 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, to be granted UK visas. They travelled 800 miles to an airport in Warsaw, Poland, where they were due to fly to London under the UK government's Homes for Ukraine scheme. Vera Rybolchenko, who's 68, lost her passport in the evacuation, but was assured by the British Embassy that she would be allowed to travel because she had a paper copy of the document as well as a newly issued UK visa and a Ukrainian identity card. The family passed through security without a problem, but minutes before they were due to board, Rybachenko was wrongly told by BA staff that she could not leave without her original passport. BA have admitted this was a mistake and has issued an apology to the family. They said, "We're very sorry for this genuine error made by our team when trying to follow the Home Office guidance. And we put measures in place to ensure this doesn't happen again. We're making contact with the family to apologise and we will be providing a full refund of their tickets." The family had arrived at the airport at 6 a.m. with all their belongings before an 8:25 a.m. flight to London Heathrow. Hanna Zaravayeva, the daughter and accountant, said that they were left without explanation or apology by BA staff after being wrongly refused permission to board. They eventually boarded an 8 p.m. flight to London on a locked Polish Airlines plane after an employee at the Hungarian airline Wizz Air created a temporary travel document for Rybachenko. So I'll quickly move on because we don't know if this is a kind of an attitude, a British attitude, that we're not supposed to let people in without documents, or whether it's just a simple mistake, right? BA seem to be saying just a complete error and we're not going to do it again. We've told the staff what to do. So let's just hope that is an error, Roger, and they're not going to do it again. Now, but let's look at let's combine that with the story from Neil Gray, the Scottish Government Minister, who's now been taken over progress for Ukrainian refugees trying to get into Scotland. Now, data today shows that 55,600 applications have been made by Ukrainians to the UK government's Homes for Ukraine scheme, with 1,620 visas relating to the Scottish sponsors having been issued to the Home Office by the Home Office and by 570 under Scotland's super sponsor arrangements. Neil Gray, who's a minister with special responsibility for refugees from Ukraine, said, "While there has been progress in the number of visas approved by the UK government, we need to see it continue. We have consistently said that the pace at which the Home Office was moving on visas was simply not good enough. And while we recognise changes have been made, we will continue to press the UK government to do all it can to speed up their approval process." The Scottish Government established itself as a super sponsor to get the people of Ukraine to safety quickly, and the frustratingly slow pace has worked against that aim. As the brutal war in Ukraine continues and millions have fled their homes, we will continue with the vital work of offering a warm Scots welcome to all Ukrainians who wish to find safety and sanctuary in Scotland. So put the BA story in context of the UK government's obvious reluctance to let people in. Do you think the BA are taking on Priti Patel's attitude here? Do you think that's anything to do with that kind of mistake being made?
Yes, well, what we are aware of is that there are now information coming out that suggests that this is not the only family who have been treated in this way by BA. We don't know exactly how many, but it looks as if this has not been an isolated incident, and therefore we can't inevitably put it down to the errors of one individual making a genuine mistake. I do think the whole attitude of the UK government has created a culture that has been very unhelpful. I mean, it was interesting that in the BA statement, it said they were doing their best to follow Home Office requirements. Well, Home Office requirements seem to be as unhelpful as possible, so they seem to have followed that to the letter. The one thing I would say, moving on to what you've just said to Hugh, is that about the attitude of the Scottish government. I think they are to be commended, and in particular, I was really pleased to hear that it was Neil Gray was given responsibility. I had the pleasure of working with Neil in Westminster for the time that I was an MP, and I think he will be somebody who is not only extraordinarily hardworking, he's definitely up to the task, and he's definitely somebody who will have the right attitude and a very different attitude to Priti Patel.
Yes, I remember Linda Fabiani was with me in the studio when we heard that Neil Gray had taken on that job, and she echoed what you've said. He'll do a fine person in that post. Now, we're going to continue with this theme of people getting into the UK and finding it difficult to do so. We hear today of a bizarre story from the UK government that tens of thousands of refugees seeking sanctuary in the UK will be flown more than 4,000 miles to Rwanda under a new set of immigration policies announced today by Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister insisted at a press conference that the African state, criticised last year by the UK for its human rights record, was one of the safest countries in the world. He also announced that the Royal Navy would take over patrolling the Channel to intercept small boats from France. Home Office insiders confirmed the plan was to give detainees a one-way ticket to the country to encourage them to establish new lives there. The timing of the announcement has led to claims that Johnson is using the policy to deflect from becoming the first Prime Minister to be found guilty of a criminal offence while in office. Commenting on the plans, the Scottish Government's External Affairs Secretary Angus Robertson said, "This is an outrageous policy. The Home Office should focus on improving the asylum system and not finding new and shameful ways to make it more challenging and prolonged for the people seeking safety from persecution." Angus Robertson continued, "The UK government must explain how it will ensure the welfare of extremely vulnerable people in any offshoring arrangements when it appears to be washing their hands over them." The SNP's Home Affairs spokesperson at Westminster, Stewart MacDonald MP, said, "It's utterly shameful that Boris Johnson is putting forward these toxic and inhumane policies in a desperate attempt to distract from his law-breaking to appease Tory backbench MPs. These plans mark a depressingly new low for this broken Tory government." The Scottish Greens called the proposals a disgraceful new low. First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, tweeted that the plans were cruel and inhumane and a cynical distraction from the Prime Minister's law breaking. So there are several different points that strike me, and I'm going to return in a couple of minutes to that one about the timing just before Easter holidays. But I'd like to put you to dwell, please, Roger, on Angus Robertson's words about outsourcing. What was the phrase he used? He said that, well, this idea that we are putting people on a plane instead of processing them on here. What about the actual principle behind that? What was it? I'm trying to find the actual quote. Offshoring, yes. So Angus Robertson talked about offshoring. Is the principle of offshoring itself something you'd oppose fundamentally before we look at the question of where they're being offshored to?
Well, I would agree with the comments that Angus Robertson has made and others about this being utterly ridiculous and inhumane. I would also point out that it appears to me to demonstrate to a remarkable incompetence in the UK government in the following regard. Every time Boris Johnson speaks, the policy becomes a bit different. When he originally spoke about this some hours ago, he indicated that it was for younger males who would be considered to be economic migrants. And then it has changed to be, no, it's not just about younger males. It is now to be about anybody who falls into the particular category. So it could be whole families, for example. But the idea that you're doing anything that has got humanitarian rights at their front by saying, we're not just going to wash our hands of you, but we're going to shove you in an aircraft and fly you 4,500 miles to a country that you know nothing about, probably. I mean, that strikes me as utterly degrading any thought that there is an operation here that's got any ethical standing at all.
Now, these sort of offshoring arrangements are not new, although this is the first time the UK government has, well, it's the first time they've put it into practice. They did actually raise this a few weeks or a couple of months ago and then dropped it, and now they've brought it back again just before Easter. But we'll come back to the timing. But other plans like this have, well, Australia sent people to Papua New Guinea. I think Israel also sent people somewhere else. But both of these, but they were both a dismal failure, an expensive failure. Now, what do you think Rwanda gets out of this? Presumably the British government is paying them. Does Rwanda stand to gain? Are they looking for young people in their population?
Well, I would imagine, I'm not aware that the demography is a problem that they're trying to fill gaps there. But of course, Rwanda is a relatively poor country. And so that no doubt, and who can blame them, they will be looking toward ways in which they can earn funds from this. Now, my understanding is this is going to cost many millions of pounds that will flow from the UK to Rwanda to get them to receive these refugees. So I would imagine that their motivation is economic in nature rather than humanitarian in nature.
Yeah, I guess obviously the UK government, there is a figure of 120 million mentioned today. I don't know if that's a one-off or if it's every year, but the UK government is obviously going to send some money to Rwanda if this thing ever goes ahead. Now, the other point I had a quick look at today, and Rwanda is in fact not a very large country, but it does have a population of about 12.6 million. And also the average GDP divided by the number of people in the population works out at an average of $800. So it's not a rich country, and it is actually quite full up, actually. It's much more densely populated than the UK. In fact, it's the fifth most densely populated country in the world, actually. Quite a big population and quite a small landlocked country to the east of Africa. So for those reasons, anyway, that's all I know about their demographics, Roger. So it doesn't look like a place that's crying out for people. They've got plenty already. But what about the Johnson's assertion that Rwanda is a safe place? Just how democratic, just how peaceful is Rwanda nowadays? A country that has a very recent, very, very violent history.
Yes, well, I do know that it is still the case that there are concerns amongst many humanitarian organizations about the risks that are posed to individuals in Rwanda, particularly if they're critical of the government and the like. So there are problems about the human rights records in different ways. And it's certainly not, it doesn't share the kind of democratic heritage that we would here in Scotland. And so from that point of view, I think it's understandable that many humanitarian organisations are fearful about what the consequences will be for people who, as you quite rightly say, in demographic terms, it's not that they're needed for specific jobs, it's not that they're being recruited for particular purposes. It appears that they're only being received so that they can earn money from the UK government who want to wash their hands on this. So it all strikes me as having all the recipes of going to be a disaster. And I think you make a very good point, Hugh, earlier when you pointed out that in the few occasions where this has been tried in the past, such as by Australia, it cannot be described as having been anything other than a failure. And so why we think in the UK that suddenly we've got the recipe in a panic to make this work, I don't know where this comes from. It strikes me that it feeds into what you indicated you were going to move on to talk to, and that is it raises deep questions about why now?
Okay, I will come to that in a second. One other aspect of it I thought we should explore is the argument. The key argument that Prime Minister Johnson has made is that it's necessary to break the business model of the traffickers, and that's a point that Priti Patel and other UK government ministers have said all along, that people make money from trafficking the poor folk who float across the channel in these wee boats. Somebody's getting paid for it, and so the idea is to remove the profit incentive. So another way of doing that, of course, is to let them in and process their applications in the UK, let them on a proper ferry so that they don't have to do that. But that's what Prime Minister Johnson said today. We are going to break the business model of the people traffickers, right? What's the chances of this being an effective weapon?
I can't see how on earth it is going to do that. Indeed, if anything, it might provide an incentive for them to charge even more money because they say we've got to look for even more circuitous routes of getting you into the UK. And so that I just don't understand that argument at all. And it's interesting that although they've made that claim, they've given absolutely no details of how it is actually going to accomplish that. So I don't believe a word of it.
Yep. Well, a business model, it's supply and demand. If there's still demand there, then somebody will still supply, won't they? In fact, somebody did say in one of the stories I was reading today that what's to stop the traffickers then trafficking people out of Rwanda further north. Yeah, there's
Exactly.
maybe unproven hypothesis. So let's finally get to the question of timing. As I recall, this idea of shipping people to or flying people to Rwanda was raised, I forget when, it was raised a few months ago, then dropped, and now it's back again. Is that a kind of way of news management that you propose something, everyone complains, and then you drop it, and then you can step back and assess what the reaction was, and then try it again later? Is the timing partly kind of massaging public opinion?
Well, governments to some degree always have to try to manage the publicity for government policies and things like that. And in normal circumstances, there's no problem there. But I think in this case, it's absolutely blatant and we know what's happening. It's all coming out at exactly the same time as Boris Johnson and the Chancellor are being fined for breaking the law. And so it's part of trying to get a cover for them to try and ride out the next week in particular, which is going to be very problematic for them. So I have absolutely no doubt that the reason it has suddenly been put into the public domain is this is an ideal story. Why? It's an ideal story because it's controversial and it will get lots of headlines, as it's already getting. And that is a cover for not dealing with the more substantial and immediate crisis that the government are in relation to breaking their own laws.
Yeah, we've been suckered into it ourselves because here we are talking about it, of course, as required to do. Just the final point on this announcement in the holidays, of course, is that your critics will say this is the sort of thing you should be discussing in Parliament. That's why people like yourself and your other MPs ought to be debating the very points we're talking about, but they're on holidays. So is there an increasing tendency for governments to release difficult news when there's nobody there to scrutinise it.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, there are different devices they use to put out difficult news. This is certainly one of them, and it certainly suits them. That I mean, it's never going to be a good thing that anybody is seen to have been breaking the law in government. But if there's any time that's more convenient than any other, it's when Parliament's not sitting. I do see that, for example, it's going to be next Wednesday now. There is going to be some debate about this, particularly in relation to whether Boris Johnson has misled Parliament. And of course, claims that he said he's going to set the record straight. Well, I mean, the general requirement is that immediately you know that you've misled Parliament, you set the record straight away. You don't say, I'm going to wait a week before I tell you my view on how far I have misled Parliament. So I think this is another indication of trying to find ways of making this news wane in significance in the public mind before it is then debated next week. But I think they're going to have real trouble in doing so. I mean, my understanding is that further fines are on their way, and this is just going to add to the trouble that the government are in.
Well, in a situation like that, who would want to be canvassing for the Conservative Party with the Scottish Council elections just about 3 weeks away? So today we've heard the release of the Scottish Conservatives manifesto. Now, one of the items in there, which we've picked on today, is the in addition to promising better services with fewer potholes, reductions in high street business rates, and all this with lower council tax, the Conservatives have also launched proposals to help school students catch up from the COVID disruptions. Conservatives want funding for extra classes in school and to pay for one-to-one or small group private tutoring. They also want the Scottish Government to pilot extending the school day. The Scottish Green Party said that would be a disaster for pupils' mental health. Their education spokesperson, Ross Greer, said that the Tories are going to increasingly absurd lengths to take Scotland's education system back 100 years. Mr Greer commented that pupils did not only miss out on education, but also on social opportunities, and as he put it, a myriad of other things which bring joy to their lives. In contrast, the Greens call for more investment in schools to tackle teachers' heavy workload. Ross Greer said that the Scottish Government, with its two Green ministers, had funded the largest increase in funding for a generation. Conservatives also want to promote what they call school autonomy, where teachers will be empowered to run schools in the best way for their pupils. Douglas Ross, who introduced the party's manifesto today in Glasgow, was briefly interrupted by anti-poverty campaigner Sean Clerkin, who told Three Jobs Ross, as he called him, that people were being forced into poverty by Conservative policies. And he insisted that the UK government should increase benefits by 7 to 9% because of inflation, and that it should also increase or restore the £20 a week cut in universal credit. So Mr Clerkin was then escorted out of the room, having said his piece. So let me look at two aspects of this, Roger. First of all, the whole question of the COVID, the loss of educational opportunities. Everybody, of course, wants to catch up. Now, so have you any particular comments on the general need to help pupils who have had 2 years of their education severely disrupted? Everybody wants to catch up, don't they?
Everybody wants to catch up, and everybody is concerned to make sure that all is being done to make sure that the resources are in place to allow that to happen. But this statement by the Tories is a typical kind of statement when you get no responsibility, when you just say, we're going to increase the school day, we're going to lengthen the amount of time pupils are there, and where are the resources going to come from? We've already got a workforce that has suffered considerably because of illness, that are overstretched, that are stretched. So where are you going to get the teachers? Are you going to tell the teachers, oh, you've got to start working an extra 5 hours a week or more at a time when you're under incredible burdens anyway? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's nobody else able to teach other than teachers in our education system. And I just don't think this is a realistic proposition at all. It's thoughtless in many ways. And I do agree with the comment that you have to think on the implications for children. Now, not merely in terms of their mental health, but in terms of the capacity of people to learn. Even as adults, I know that, for example, in teaching at university level, where you have got grown-up students, that the general rule is they cannot a lecture should not be any more than 45 minutes. It's about the maximum amount of time an adult can effectively take in any learning. So the notion that you can suddenly just increase learning time for pupils and expect that that will lead to their better development, there is no evidence to support that.
Yeah, of course, you get diminishing returns, don't you? You increase the hours, you
Yeah.
don't necessarily increase the output. Now, the other aspect of the Tories' idea, though, no, I must admit, I haven't read the whole of the manifesto. I don't know where they intend to pay for it. But of course, they do want to kind of outsource. They're talking about tuition. I take it that means getting private tutors involved and either working at home or else getting small groups together. They haven't said where that would be, if that would be in school or if it would be in community facilities. But uh, that combined with the idea that they want to sort of devolve schools and devolve decision making to schools, does this look to you like a kind of a privatisation of education, trying to take some of the responsibility away from Scottish education ministers?
I, I think the way in which I would characterise it is that there's utter chaos in the minds of the Tories of what they want to do. You know, on the one hand, they say we're going to increase the number of hours where people are in schools. On the other hand, they say we're going to increase the availability of support out of school. And then at the same time as they're saying, and at the same time as this is going on, we're going to change the curriculum. Now, how on earth is this all going to be accomplished, even if it were a good idea, which I don't think it is? In practical terms, it's just impossible to undertake. So that would be my main criticism here.
So that's what the Tories are saying on education and their manifestos online. I've just picked on that one point, of course. There's many other points that we haven't had time to cover tonight. So I'm going to move on, Roger, to our next story today, which is about the COVID vaccine developed by Valneva. This is the company who have their manufacturing in Livingston. The COVID-19 vaccine developed by French pharmaceutical company Valneva has been given regulatory approval by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. That's a bit of a mouthful. That's also known as the MHRA. The approval has come despite the development programme being set back when the UK government abruptly terminated its vaccine supply contract with Valneva in September of 2021. The Scottish Government, however, continued to support the development of the Valneva vaccine at the company's Livingston facility by awarding Valneva a £20 million grant in February of this year. The UK's independent medicines regulator was the first in the world to approve the Valneva project. That's the MHRA. Unlike the other approved COVID JAGs, the Valneva vaccine is an inactivated whole virus vaccine, which means that a live virus was grown in a lab, rendered unable to infect cells, and then administered to people to trigger the immune response. The MRHA said that this approach was already being used for flu and polio vaccines, and experts have previously suggested that COVID JAGs based on the whole virus vaccine may result in a broader immune response than those that involve only the spike protein and may work better against new variants. Results released by Valneva in October suggested that the vaccine would be at least as effective as AstraZeneca's Oxford vaccine, and the Valneva vaccine also is stable when stored in a standard refrigerator, which makes it easier to store and distribute. So that's our story. Can I just point out, Roger, I've been talking about whole virus inactivated vaccines as if I knew what I was talking about. I assure you I don't, but suffice it to say that this appears to be an effective vaccine. It works differently to the others, but for some reason the UK government cancelled. I think I remember at the time Sajid Javid said, we're cancelling it now for unspecified business reasons. Can you remember what he said? I was still waiting for those reasons to be specified. Have you heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's all shrouded in a bit of mystery exactly why they suddenly did a volte-face and to refuse it. And you're right in saying they indicated it was for business or contractual reasons, but without any specification. And as I recall, the company challenged this and challenged them to demonstrate why there were contractual reasons and the like. I have to say, great credit to the Scottish Government in deciding that we're going to continue to support this. Great credit, I think, to the local MP, Hannah Bardell, for campaigning so strongly on it continually and keeping it in the forefront of the news. And I think the Scottish Government and Hannah have been completely vindicated by now the approval that's been given. Now, I'm a bit like you, Hugh. I can't claim to have the scientific expertise to do a relative assessment of one vaccine against the other. But like you, from what I've read so far, it looks as if this is an extremely valuable addition to the availability of appropriate vaccines for the Scottish Government and the Scottish people.
Yep, as I recall at the time, the European Medicines Agency had actually licensed Valneva for use in the European Union while it was actually being manufactured here, but it wasn't until now actually possible to use it in Scotland. Now, yeah. Just one thing before I move on, we are of course giving a lot of our money to a big pharma company. Is that the world we're in? Do we just have to do that? Do we have to accept that the huge research costs in new vaccines aren't going to be undertaken by private companies unless they're kind of backed up, underwritten by government guarantees and supports?
I think for this type of crisis, global crisis situation that you're in, then there have been huge issues of pace of research development, which requires a lot of resources, and also huge productive capacity, which also requires a lot of resources. So I think in this particular example of this pandemic, it was inevitable that large corporations were going to be involved in these types of activities. That's maybe not the same that was involved in all areas of medical research and development, but I think it's understandable in this case. Of course, then what happens is there is a burden on governments to make sure that their whole procurement and all the rest of it from these companies, that there's proper negotiations, that there's not a unrestricted profiteering on the back of it. So I think it creates very particular challenges to make sure that the public are getting the value, not just medically, but economically, out of the deals that are struck.
Yep, value for money, yep. So obviously there are huge research costs involved, and that's why governments are often invited to help. Going to move over to America now. We've heard a very unpleasant story today. A black man face down on the ground was fatally shot in the back of the head by a Michigan police officer. The violent climax of a traffic stop, foot chase and fight over a stun gun, according to videos of the April the 4th incident, which have been released by police on Wednesday. Patrick Loyola, who was 26, a Congolese refugee, was killed on a residential street in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Video footage showed Mr. Loyola running from a white police officer who stopped him for driving with a license plate that didn't match the vehicle. They struggled in front of several houses while Mr. Loyola's passenger got out and started filming. Shortly afterwards, the officer shot Mr. Loyola, who was face down on the ground in the back of the head. After protests in the city calling for justice, the police chief Eric Winstrom released 4 videos, including critical footage of the shooting recorded by that passenger in Mr. Loyola's car. "I view it as a tragedy," said Mr. Winstrom, a former high-ranking Chicago police commander who became the Grand Rapids police chief last month. Grand Rapids is a city to the northwest of Detroit. The officer, a 7-year vet, will not be identified publicly unless there are criminal charges, said Mr. Winstrom, who is now placed on paid leave with his police powers suspended. Michigan State Police are conducting a criminal investigation. A civil rights attorney, Benjamin Crump, has been retained by the Loyola family and has pushed for the officer to be fired and charged with offences. The video clearly shows that this was an unnecessary, excessive and fatal use of force against an unarmed black man who was confused by the encounter and terrified for his life, said Mr. Crump, who has represented numerous victims of police violence. Patrick Loyola, came to the US fleeing violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2014. He has 2 young daughters and 5 siblings. He arrived in the United States as a refugee with his family fleeing violence. He had his whole life ahead of him, said the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. Wrote another sad story. So this is obviously unfolding. We don't know if there's going to be any criminal charges, but these things just keep on happening in America, don't they? Is there any way of getting out of this idea of basically white on black violence in America?
I mean, it is a colossal challenge. I mean, it's a desperate situation. And unfortunately, these desperate situations are occurring week after week after week in different parts of the United States, it would appear. And that the Black Lives Matter movement, which I support, has not gained sufficient momentum to turn this all around as yet. So I think there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be doing. I don't know if there is a short-term answer to it. Very often, to create the type of cultural change necessary takes a very long time. But simply send my condolences for what it's worth to the family affected, and I'm sure everyone listening in this evening will be equally saddened to hear yet another case of this type has arisen.
Yes, very sad, as the gentleman in question was, of course, fleeing violence and didn't find the security he was looking for in the United States. So we'll report on that if criminal charges are embarked upon. Next story now, also in America, Elon Musk has launched an audacious bid to buy the whole of Twitter at a price of more than $40 billion, saying he wants to release its extraordinary potential to boost free speech and democracy across the world. The Tesla chief executive, the world's richest person, revealed in the regulatory filing on Thursday that he had launched a hostile takeover of Twitter. The news came just days after he bought a 9% stake in the social media company and was subsequently offered a seat on the board, but he refused to take up that position. In a letter to Brett Taylor, chair of Twitter, Musk said that the site was not thriving as a company or as a tool for improving freedom of speech and needs to be transformed as a private company. Mr. Musk, who himself has 80 million followers on Twitter, said if his offer was not accepted, he would reconsider his position as a shareholder, as he doesn't at the moment have the confidence in Twitter's current management. In a statement, Twitter confirmed it had received the unsolicited proposal and that the board would carefully review it to determine the course of action it believes to be in the best interests of the company and all Twitter stockholders. In 2018, Musk came under investigation by the SEC, that's the Securities Commission, for a tweet saying that he planned to take Tesla into private ownership. The SEC found against him over the tweet and said that Musk agreed to submit his public statements about the company's finances for vetting by its legal counsel. He was later found to have violated that settlement and eventually agreed to step down as Tesla's chair and to appoint an additional independent director or several directors, and also agreed to pay penalties of $40 million. Analysts are watching to see how the SEC will react to Musk's Twitter offer. So first of all, I don't know if can you offer me any help on the rules of the SEC? So clearly Musk decides to do something and he doesn't trouble to look at the rules first. So there's important rules, aren't there, about if you are going to take over a company or make a bid. I think you have to announce it to make sure everything's out in the open, don't you?
Yes, I'm not sure of all the regulations that hold sway in the United States, but there inevitably will be considerable regulations that apply in the way in which you have to undertake bids. It certainly is odd, to say the very least, that such a major takeover bid can be made in such a fashion. I will be surprised if it's compliant with the regulations in the United States, but we wait and see. And and it's generally a surprising bid to me at all. Such a vast sum of money to take over Twitter. So I think there are deep questions about what the motive is behind this move.
Now, he has, of course, stated that it's about freedom of speech. So Twitter, of course, does have an important role to play in, of course, places like Russia where clearly there isn't any free press. Now, have you any comments on that? Do you think Twitter is a force for good, if you like, and can it be made any better if Mr. Musk's in charge of it?
Well, Well, I personally, my personal view is I think there's problems with social media sites like Twitter and Facebook and the like, and the amount of abuse that is freely brought forward from anonymous sources, which I think is generally unhelpful for proper expressions, proper debate in terms of freedom of speech. So I'm not sure quite what the plans are for that. I mean, I've long stopped using Facebook. I do use Twitter, but I don't find it a very reliable source of good information, I would have to say. So that's why I said what the long-term expectations of Musk are in relation to this, what he actually intends doing, what his motives actually are. I think these are shrouded in mystery at the moment.
Yes, of course, we use Twitter ourselves a lot, but we do follow a lot of journalists in Ukraine at the moment, so it certainly is handy. But I wouldn't ever put out on this program something I just read on Twitter unless I gone and checked it somewhere else first of all. So, of course, Twitter can be an echo chamber, can't it? We follow people who agree with us, so it's not very good at getting debates and alternative points of view, and also it's very good at abuse, of course, as you pointed out. So, big questions there. Let's see what happens with the SEC. So I can't remember what the E stands for. That's the Securities Commission, which is the body overseeing takeovers. Can you remember what the SEC stands for? Exchange. I'm just told it's the Securities and Exchange Commission. So it's the rules of takeovers in the New York stock market. Now, let's move on to just one final story tonight, Roger, which is in Scotland. Displaced Ukrainian students who are settling here will be given access to free tuition and living cost support. That's subject to parliamentary approval. Under new proposals from the Scottish Government, Ukrainians wishing to embark on a further or higher education course from this academic year 22-23 will be eligible for free tuition and living cost support, provided they have submitted an application to the Homes for Ukraine or the Ukrainian Family or the Ukraine Extension Schemes. Existing Ukrainian students who had previously started courses in Scotland and who are experiencing hardship will be eligible to apply for immediate financial assistance through the newly created £1 million International Students Emergency Fund. The Minister for Further and Higher Education, Jamie Hepburn, said, "We are determined to do everything we can to give displaced people from Ukraine the warmest welcome possible, and we want to ensure students arriving here have the support they need to start or to continue their higher and further education. By extending home fee status and living cost support to students arriving from Ukraine, we hope to provide some stability and assurance at this deeply troubling time, and to ensure those forced to flee their homes can live safely and comfortably in Scotland for as long as they need to. We've created a new £1 million International Students Emergency Fund. This will help Ukrainian students already in Scotland who find themselves in hardship due to the situation to continue their studies." Right, so clearly you're going to welcome this. I'm not going to ask you that. Good thing, eh? Does this deal with problems that have been raised by universities a couple of months ago? Various universities said, what are we going to do with students who have now come to the end of their studies? Are we supposed to pap them back to Ukraine, where they might get into serious difficulties, or are we allowed to keep them here? So does this help universities to manage their current students and former students who are in those difficulties?
Well, I hope it will help. But what I would also like to point out is that I think this more generally is very supportive of what a number of universities, for example, have already been doing in the last few weeks. I know, for example, that Stirling University, that I've got a connection with, have got special programs already set up for both prospective students and for prospective staff who are from Ukraine. And indeed, I have been promoting this amongst some students connected to Ukraine over the last few weeks, and I know that it's been hugely welcomed. So the way in which I would see it is I think the Scottish Government initiative is not only to be applauded, but it sits alongside other initiatives that individual institutions are trying to make at the moment. So from that point of view, I think it is tremendously helpful.
So, do you happen to know then, what about the situation of a Ukrainian student, or maybe from other countries such as Belarus, who will be finishing their studies? Of course, the university courses will be winding up in a couple of weeks. So, are people who have now reached the end of their BA degree, are they going to be included in the kind of schemes you're talking about?
Well, they would be included if they wanted to go on and do further studies. So that, for example, if they wanted to go on from a bachelor's degree to do a master's degree, or if they wanted to go on and do a higher degree by way of research and the like. So there are different avenues that would be open to them in that regard. I don't exactly know what the situation will be if they choose to leave the university at the end of their undergraduate studies and wish to remain but not pursue any further education. I mean, I think we await further details to see how far that support would be supplied.
Yes, so the situation, I believe, is that the Scottish universities have raised this question of what about people who are
Yes,
not continuing studying, and will they still have a visa? Will they still be allowed to remain in the UK? So I think really we have to again say that's up to the UK Home Office. So the universities
absolutely.
are,
And that's the big
so
question.
it might be that maybe the issue in this new programme from the Scottish Government is about financial support. So I don't think the Home Office is going to say to people, your visa's up, so get out. But the question is, will they be able to work? So it's a question of who's funding them. So I think there's some questions there. But anyway, that's welcome, obviously, to the students who are going to continue their studies. But that maybe raises other questions for people who have finished. So that's about it for tonight. Roger, so those are the stories we wanted to look through. Some of them are continuing and we'll no doubt come back to them. So I'll be doing that tomorrow. Incidentally, Roger, thank you very much for joining us. And we're on the road tomorrow. So I hope you can tune in, and I hope that the rest of you watching, we're out on the road because we are going to be, we have an interesting show. Let's just say we think we have an interesting program for you tomorrow. So I advise you all to tune in again. So let me just finish tonight by, first of all, thanking Roger, and also for thanking you for watching tonight's show. So I hope we'll see you again. Roger Mullin, thanks for tonight's contribution. And
Thank
also
you.
kind of remind you all that we're supported entirely by your fundraising, and that means probably if you're watching right now, you are one of our supporters. And if you're not, please consider looking at the website there. And it really does mean a lot to us if you click on the button to start a direct debit. Even a £5 or a tenner makes all the difference. We know that things are getting expensive, but of course that applies to us as well because we've big bills to pay to keep these machines running. Also, could you do us a favour? Why don't you follow us on Twitter and maybe give us some feedback? What have you thought about the programme, the stories we've been discussing on the programme, and spread the word, and let's start this conversation. So please help us by spreading the word, by passing us on your social media if you use it. And of course, if you can help to fund us, that would be great because we don't receive any public funding. Okay, so we'll be back tomorrow and I'm going to be presenting, I think what you'll find is an interesting programme. So I'll tell you more about that at Scotland at 7 on Friday. So thanks for watching tonight. So from Hugh Stewart, good night from Glasgow.